All right, I know I'm very tardy to this party, but I had a lot of thoughts about this, and I wanted to really digest and really, marinate in them before I just went ahead and made more of a reactionary video about this album. So I think enough time has passed. I've digested the album enough to have a better, fully thought out take on this album. So let's dive into it. Ocean Without a Shore by Weather Systems. So Weather Systems needs a little bit of context before I jump right into them. And, instead of I just saying that they're a brand new UK progressive rock band, there's a little bit more context than we need from that. So this is a duo of Daniel Kavanagh and Daniel Cardoso, who were originally from Anathema or Atema or however you want to pronounce it. I always pronounce it as Anathema. I know that some people pronounce it as Atema. I'm going to go forward with my Anathema so I don't have to, stop my brain from thinking about it. Initially, this was going to be Daniel's kind of next step within the Anathema discography and catalog after they were, writing music for The Optimist back in 2017. Through falling outs and complications within the band, that project essentially fell apart. And it was very clear that Anathema as a band could no longer function as they wanted it to, which is why we haven't had an album released from Anathema since The Optimist from 2017. Now, I have loved Anathema from about the 2010s. The first album I heard from them was obviously Weather Systems, but I went back and I fell into Falling Deeper, We're Here Because We're Here, and then their 2014 album of Distant Satellites, I grew to love. And those 4 records from them, in my mind, it's kind of like their crowning jewel. I loved how atmospheric they were. I loved how emotional they were, how passionate they were with. Now, The Optimist, I'm kind of less excited for, and I feel like they kind of went out on a whimper rather than a bang. But the thing that I came to Anathema for was their build-ups, their atmospheres, their longer passages of music, their big, grandiose statements, and tackling some pretty heavy concepts, usually around death, life, what life means, what we can bring to life, and that kind of thing. The big brain stuff. So when Daniel Kavanagh, one of the driving forces of Anathema, wanted to continue, and it was very clear that that wasn't going to happen with Anathema, he was like, okay, do I make this another solo project because he's done a couple in the past, or do I do something completely different? He kind of split the bill a little bit, and I think this is where I have the biggest issue with this album, because this album and this band feels like a spiritual successor to Anathema to its detriment. We do have 2 past individuals from the band with a few other individuals kind of helping them out a little bit. And it feels like a side project to Anathema rather than being its own item. Even naming the band Weather Systems after the band's biggest record, as well as having the actual album artwork look very similar to Weather Systems, the album. It feels like if when Tony Banks and Michael Rutherford in the late 90s decided to make Calling All Stations, instead of making it a Genesis album, decided to call themselves Duke, and they had a very similar Duke style artwork on it, I would be like, that's not great, Now, I am glad that they decided to distance themselves from Anathema because, yeah, the music on here does kind of feel like watered down Anathema, but I feel as if they're doing essentially a disservice by having that umbilical cord attached so heavily to themselves and this album, to Anathema. Because the music suffers because of it. This album is split into 2 parts. Part 1 encompassing songs 1 to 5, being First Steps, and part 2 covering tracks 6 through 9 being Learning to Fly. And I appreciate how they're splitting this up. It creates 2 sides to this album that I really enjoy. But as I mentioned before, because we are lacking some of those notable individuals from this band, mainly Lee Douglas being the lead vocalist, as well as Vincent Kavanagh, who is kind of the lead backing vocals, electric, acoustic guitars, keyboards, synths, programming, and co-producer on this. It just feels as if Daniel is floundering a little bit without the other individuals, mainly his brother, to help him with the songwriting ship. This would have been a little bit better as a solo project of Dan's rather than this whole new project. Now, the music itself still is fine. The opening track of Synesthesia is fine. I like the build up. I like the atmosphere that we have on here. It is very much an anathema light. It's missing kind of those I don't know, je ne sais quoi aspects of the anathema. Like, it's missing kind of that heavenly aspect of it. It's missing the juice. I think is the best way to put it. It's missing that special sauce. I like the fact that it is the longest track. It allows itself to build itself up, and I do enjoy the climb, but it always feels like it doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't have that natural progression. And these tracks also have a number of like part 3 or part 2 without having a part 1 or a conclusion about it. The third track of Untouchable Part 3, it just kind of feels like we're in the middle of a chapter of a book that we haven't read before. And it doesn't really have a beginning. It doesn't have an end. It's just kind of like this middle part. Now, the second track that I skipped over of Do Angels Sing Like Rain, I feel is very atmospheric. It has this grounding aspect that, tethers you to the ground while you're surveying a lot of the upper atmosphere on here. And that, I think, is where this band shines. This is where Daniel Kavanagh's writing ship within this band really flourishes, but he's kind of missing that oomph. He's missing that thing that's tying this all together. And that is definitely found on Ghost in the Machine, which is a lot more atmospheric. It's a lot less grounded, at least within Untouchable and Do Angels Sing Like Rain, have that little bit of a tether. This one just feels like it's kind of wandering the landscape, doesn't quite know where it wants to go, which leads us to the end of part 1, which is Are You There Part 2. And again, I'm just feeling like I'm wandering the landscape without any perch. Like, I feel like part 1 has some good ideas, and I really enjoy the guitar work that Dan is putting on. His vocalizations and his singing styles are very pleasant and very well utilized, but it just feels like, okay, I have this guitar lick, but I'm not quite sure what I want to do with it. I'm not quite sure how I want to develop it. So I'm just going to kind of string the track along with this one little guitar lick that doesn't quite go anywhere. It's for that reason that I think part 2 I like a little bit more. Like, Still Lake might be my favorite track on here. I love the synths. I love how driven it is. This is one of the few tracks that has a very good build-up and gradual flow to it. There's a little bit more meat to sink your teeth into, and I love, as I mentioned, that gradual build of this. This is continued with Take Me With You. That is a little bit more somber, a little bit more intimate. It starts the track off with this like little kid's vocalization that kind of grounds the track in the innocence of this child that can be a little bit cheesy and I think is overplayed just a little bit, but it's still entertaining enough and it has enough interesting aspects and flows to it that I can kind of give it a pass, which then leads us to the longest track off of this second side of the title track of Ocean Without a Shore. And unfortunately, we fall into the track of an interesting idea that doesn't know where to go. And I just wish that there was something that this track wanted to do with it, rather than it just kind of wandering the landscape. And it does feel like an ocean without a shore, like I'm waiting to come to land and I'm not there. This brings us to the last track, and the last track at least goes out with quite a big bang. It's one of the highlights of the album. The Space Between Us. It feels very jovial. It ends with this triumphant call. It does flirt with feeling like Coldplay a little bit. I'll give it a pass because at least they're doing something interesting and something more with it. But it was one of the first times and only times on the album that I felt like I had something to hold on to. I had something to grip and be like, okay, I can play with this. I can ruminate on it without it just kind of being lost in the landscape. So yeah. Ocean Without a Shore was an interesting debut album for this new project called Weather System. I wish that there's some very interesting ideas found on here, and I think with a little bit more of a fleshed out band, it could have done something really surprising and really interesting. I think twofold. One, they wanted to stick way too close to the original Anathema, and two, they didn't want to experiment and try new things with more band members. I think if they opened up the floodgates and allowed more voices to be found on this, it would feel a little bit more realized than what we have on here. But what we have, I think this will satisfy diehard Anathema fans as well as Dan Kavanaugh fans. But for the casual listener of both of those bands and artists, I think you're going to be let down. Like, there's no world in which I would listen to this over Distant Satellites, or We're Here Because We're Here, or Weather Systems, the actual album itself. So, in the end, I will say Ocean Without a Shore by Weather Systems is one that I would ultimately stream. I would still give this one a listen. You know, there's still some interesting moments on here, but I don't think I'm going to be returning to this one anytime soon now that I've digested it and I have my own thoughts made out from it. I would much rather just return to Anathema. And yeah, that's what I've got about this one. What did you guys think about this record? Did you love it? Did you hate it? I have seen a lot of people really enjoy this album, and I'm really glad that it's connecting with audiences the way that it has. It just wasn't quite for me. So yeah, let me know if you love this album, if you hated this album, by commenting down below. That's where I'm going to leave you guys for today. So thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.